So, welcome to the last segment of the CRPD course for the fall. Today, I'm going to talk about intersectionality, and um, if possible, and if people are interested, I would welcome your input and comments on this topic, your reflections. You may know something about the concept and how it's applied from your own work, or you might have thoughts stimulated by what I'm going to present. For me, I consider I consider this to be very much a kind of work in progress in my own thinking, and something that is both necessary to to place my own work in context and not necessarily take for granted perspectives where my thinking or my background reflects a more dominant perspective, such as the fact that I'm a white North American, um, and also a way to look at the aspects of my experience that where I have been more marginalized and where the experiences of discrimination and violence that that I received in as a person subject to forced psychiatry are contextualized by factors, aspects of my experience that are not part of the dominant culture, aspects where there are oppression that I experience because of being lesbian, because of being female in particular, that aren't um, that aren't part of the image that is created of any dominant narrative about anything. And so, to the extent that my experiences are informed by this, by my situation in the world, there may be aspects of my story and my advocacy that don't get heard as well unless I end up trying to bring out the fact that there are other things going on that need to be understood in order to fully hear the narrative of the oppression happening in as the experience of forced psychiatry. So, as I said, this is a work in progress. This is my presentation of the concept of intersectionality, how I've worked with it, and um, uh, okay, so we will. I very much look forward to how I can keep going with it and what other people may bring as well. So, okay, I'm going to start out by a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, a black feminist in the United States who coined the concept and term of intersectionality. The idea, in a sense, had been the idea, in a sense, had been happening for some time, for quite some time, that black feminists were saying um, that much of the writing by white women about feminism or women's situation was reflective of their perspective as white women and didn't take account of the reality of black women in some significant ways. And Kimberly Crenshaw, as a lawyer, was looking into the ways that this has actually been reflected in the law. So in her 1989 article that I've quoted from here, she addresses things like non-discrimination law and doctrine in employment, and showed how Black women were virtually almost never winning cases the way as she describes it, that Black women would be dealt out by a court saying, well, white women in this workplace weren't being discriminated against, and Black men weren't being discriminated against. Therefore, you have no claim of discrimination based on race because Black men were doing okay, and you have no claim based on sex because white women were doing okay. And essentially, the fact that they were being discriminated against as Black women, they weren't getting the benefit of what Black men got as what Crenshaw calls sex privileged Blacks. And they weren't getting the benefit of how white women were being treated and recognized as what she calls race privileged women. So Black women and their situation were being made invisible, and they were being denied justice. And so she says, I'll read from this quote. Oh, I have to go back to there. With Black women as the starting point, it becomes more apparent how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis. This single axis framework erases Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and discrimination. She might have meant race and sex discrimination, by limiting inquiry to the experiences of otherwise privileged members of the group. In other words, in race discrimination, discrimination tends to be viewed in terms of sex or class privileged Blacks. In sex discrimination cases, the focus is on race and class privileged women. And I'll share this the slides with you, and you'll be able to read this article that I've linked to. I also have two other articles by Kimberly Crenshaw that I would highly recommend, linked at the end of the slides. So, how does intersectionality apply to our experiences? Now, I've come across the concept of intersectionality, of course, and for many years, debates in the feminist movement and the different politics going on. And yet, in the psychiatric survivor movement, until pretty recently, I don't think we were highly conscious of this. For myself, when I went into the work on the CRPD, what was most important to me was working for the abolition of forced psychiatry and the related legalized discrimination of incapacity and substitute decision making. That looking at my experience as a woman and as a lesbian, it didn't feel to me like that was something that I needed to highlight in that context, because I felt while my own perspective and some of the concepts that I brought to the work on the CRPD actually were deeply informed by feminism, by feminist principles and values relating to bodily integrity and autonomy in particular, I didn't feel that there was anything to be gained in that context by highlighting, by highlighting ways in which we're not all the same as people subjected to forced psychiatry. So I made that decision. also, we did have an understanding, somewhat, a very beginning understanding or rudimentary understanding in the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, which I was representing, that there are differences between the experiences in the global South and the global North. And there were some important advocates from the global South who were part of the discussions, Bhargavi Davar from India, and then also Amita Danda from India, who came and participated in the process at the UN. And what I gained from that was one thing that I gained from the perspectives from people in India and a couple of other countries is a greater emphasis on legal capacity as an overarching violation in a way that is not necessarily the same. In a sense, I mean, I don't know. I think, let me think how I want to say this. That the first thing I became aware of was that guardianship was a much more widespread practice in some other countries against people with psychosocial disabilities than it is in the United States, and was much more on people's radar as a human rights violation that had to be addressed in itself for our community. And some of those were countries in the global South, others were countries in the global North. So it wasn't necessarily a South-North distinction, but the awareness that there may be some differences, and that there are differences geographically that, you know, that have to do with factors we may not, with specific historical factors of how institutionalization practices and the law and related things develop, that so we were somewhat aware of the need to contextualize our experiences and bring in advocacy from different places. And we did, as time went on, mostly after the convention was adopted, we did there was much more of an emphasis on bringing in and on hearing the voices from the global South and giving them room to develop and advocate what was specifically going on in their countries. The movement had certainly been dominated from the global North, and so there was a needed corrective. And I will have to acknowledge that my own work still comes from my perspective of human rights violations in the global North, and I'm still learning quite a bit when I'm in trying to in wanting to make my work relevant to activists in the global South. So that's an area where I feel that that something needs to keep improving to be relevant. My focus is on the legalized discrimination in forced psychiatry, which is a serious human rights violation, irrespective of where it occurs. And to the extent that that particular form of violation may be a violation happening in the global North more than in the global South, if the global South is not as heavily penetrated by psychiatry, then what interests me is the discussion about how, and learning from activists in the global South, how they are resisting, how they are working with an anti-colonial framework to say, look, this is your problem, rich countries, keep it away from us. We're going to find different solutions. So, but what I was coming to is that when I did start to look at intersectionality in relation to the work on the CRPD and human rights and abolition of forced psychiatry, I started to look at it primarily because a gay activist in the disability movement asked me how I experienced intersectional discrimination as a lesbian. And I realized that I didn't really know how to answer that. So I've reflected on it in a few ways, and um, I have a little bit of my story in some following slides, but I'm going to read out some questions that I think could start people thinking about how it works in your own experience. What factors shape our experience of forced psychiatry, of legal capacity, of human rights? Um, what is it that, if we're experiencing forced psychiatry, how do we tell our story about it? And what do we need for somebody to understand that they might not understand if we just say, oh, I was locked up in psychiatry and forced to take drugs or put in restraints or whatever the person's story is? What factors shape our experience of legal capacity? How do we relate ourselves to legal capacity? Do we feel it's something imposed on us and that takes away from us, or do we feel that it's something that really affirms us in the world and gives us the power to do what we want to do? What shapes our experience of human rights? Do we even think of ourselves as people having human rights? For many people, that's a very novel idea and can be inspiring and revolutionary to realize oneself as a person who has human rights. And then for others, other people might simply take it for granted. Consider what you know about intersecting systems of oppression. And as I understand intersectionality, and this has been a debate in some contexts that I've been in recently. Some people will say that it's about intersecting identities, while others specify that it's intersecting systems of discrimination. I think the concept of intersectionality really has to do with intersecting systems of oppression, and but that at the same time, other aspects of our identity also may be needed to contextualize our experiences and to really make sure that specific enough kinds of remedies and yeah, remedies and redress are developed in order to address different aspects, and that they're tailored in ways that make sense to the different contexts. So culture, beliefs and values, way of life, such as urban versus rural, profession, other aspects of identity also contextualize. What is the difference between identity and oppression? What do we politicize and how? So that's kind of getting into some bigger questions, but I think we can talk about both contextualizing our experience in terms of how it fits in the rest of our life, how we're situated in the world, and we can also talk about it in terms of how the disability-based oppression and discrimination that forced psychiatry enacts also intersect with other systems of oppression, such as oppression based on sex, oppression based on race or ethnicity, oppression based on class. And that can be very useful and important in order to make sure that our advocacy is sensitive to the other kinds of oppressions, and that we don't inadvertently, shore up some other kind of oppression when we're, excuse me, when we're advocating for the abolition of forced psychiatry. So, and I'll go into some more details later. Additional questions here. How have aspects of your experience been left out of the dominant narrative? What do you need to bring so it is complete? Not just your own story, but if aspects of your experience have been left out of the dominant narrative, by which I mean here, we can talk about the dominant narrative out in the world, in which all of us, as survivors of psychiatry, all of our experience is left out of the dominant narrative, and we are all bringing our experience in, saying this has been left out and this needs to be brought forward and even prioritized if we're talking about legal capacity and other issues that concern our lives. But also the dominant narrative in the movement, in the user survivor movement, if it is coming from a global north perspective, how do we ensure that the global south perspective is heard, and what are we missing? What happens when we put the narratives together, or simply what has been missing that needs to be added in order to have a complete narrative in the movement itself? Also, what has been left out in terms of sex-based oppression? Are the experiences of women and perspectives of women equally highlighted and credited and put forward as those of men? Sorry, I was losing. And are there ways that women experience forced psychiatry differentially, such that when we're talking about redress, we need to take certain things into consideration when we're talking about needs for support as alternative practices to the medical model? What are the differential needs of women compared to men, or what may be the differential needs that and perspectives that need to be taken into consideration? And what is the need for women who have been psychiatrized, in terms of within the dominant narrative of feminism and women's liberation? How do we, are those safe spaces for us, in a sense? Can we go to a rape crisis or domestic violence shelter? Can we go to a women only land or a women's conference and expect that we can get angry or get upset and nobody's going to call the cops to take us to psychiatry, for instance? how do aspects of your experience reflect the dominant narrative, which may mislead you into believing that it is the whole story? So if you are a white person in a white society, white dominant society, in a white settler country, how do you, what is it about your experience that is reflective of whiteness and that not of your oppression per se? And what do you need to become aware of in order to allow space for other stories to exist that are different from yours and that you can learn from? So my story, this is based on something I wrote in a Facebook group where there was a discussion about intersectionality. I am a white Jewish woman, a lesbian, and a survivor of forced psychiatric intervention. The concept of intersectionality as a way to articulate what is being ignored by frameworks that are partial and therefore to some extent discriminatory in themselves helps me address the meaning of forced psychiatry, specifically for me as a woman and lesbian. In my experience, the linkages were not as obvious as for some women, i.e., not where the forced psychiatry could simply be attributed to sexism or lesbophobia. That is not actually intersectionality, but understanding psychiatric interventions in a feminist framework, plain and simple. For me, intersectionality was required because feminism alone couldn't explain. So I go to the intersection between critical disability and the survivors of forced psychiatric interventions movement and feminism. What is in the gap? How do these oppressions intersect? And what is the meaning in my life of this totality of being forcibly psychiatrized as a lesbian woman? And then I started reflecting on, well, why didn't I talk about whiteness and Jewishness there? And I realized that I was thinking about it as oppressions. I wasn't thinking about it as that it was also a tool to think about where I did fit in the dominant narrative and contextualizing that to make room for other possibilities of other stories. So then I went on. For me, whiteness and a class position that is not poverty meant that forced psychiatry was the first time the state appeared to me as actively hostile and violent. Though something of a similar nature had been threatened in my childhood by an abusive parent, the actuality and its uniqueness in my life to that point led to a feeling of outrage and a reaction of never again, connecting myself to Holocaust survivors and bearing witness, etc. So I'm also addressing being Jewish here, and being Jewish is a non-dominant identity that, as I understand it, also is 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 an ethnicity that also makes the relationship to whiteness contingent. So that's just my sort of quick saying what it means for me to say that I'm both white and Jewish. And there, I think I'm relating to the Jewish aspect as in a cultural way, and also to the meaning of forced psychiatry as conjuring up and repeating the historical trauma of my people, that I've also found, um, for Black Americans, the experience of forced psychiatry will lead to relationships to slavery being made, um, as and indigenous women have talked about forced psychiatry as a part of the the genocidal trauma against their people and their relationship to that as historical trauma, and what is happening to them in their own lives. So continuing here, as a lesbian and woman, forced psychiatry fit within the normative way I had been socialized to appease oppression and violence by adopting a compliance pattern while keeping my real self private and inaccessible to the oppressor. The disability aspect is simply being put in that situation, the response to a person's needs and fears by violent intervention rather than solidarity, which is what I consider to be the disability discrimination there. And that can be looked at in light of patterns related to patriarchy and racism, colonialism, and state power itself as organized violence rather than community level connections and relationships. So I'm talking about disability, and then also saying in a very sketchy way how intersectionality, in my view, can lead us into a deeper and wider understanding of where forced psychiatry actually fits in the world. And I think that can be important in thinking about what it actually means to abolish forced psychiatry and what we need to look to and anticipate in the present and future if we succeed in abolishing the current disability-based violations, forced psychiatry, deprivation of legal capacity, other kinds of legalized discrimination against us, and non-legalized forms of discrimination. How might the state and capitalism and patriarchy and racism, colonialism try to respond to re-institutionalize the discriminatory practices? So that's a lot to think about, and not necessarily something that we have an easy answer to, but need to be alert and pay attention. So what is needed to tell your story? It may first appear as a gap, identifying with two movements or two different kinds of analyses of oppression, but not seeing the meaning of them together. You might experience a disconnect with the way one or both movements tell the general story. And I have been, in my own recent practice, trying to cross-fertilize the feminist movement, the lesbian feminist movement and community, and the psychiatric survivor movement and community, with bringing the values and perspectives of each one to the other. And that has been very interesting. And I think in many ways at this point, it has been most productive in my experience bringing the anti-forced psychiatry work to the lesbian feminist community. But at the same time, the basis for quite a bit of what I brought to the CRPD, especially the conceptualization of forced psychiatry as torture, and a lot of the concepts and implications of that, is very grounded in feminism. And my understanding of legal capacity has a lot to do with feminism. So sometimes it really amounts to trying to bring that out, and yet at the same time, there's still an unmet need to address sexism in our movement. Okay, and so here, talk about legal capacity for a while. I remember reading, well, I guess the first thing I'll say is that for me, legal capacity as a concept has always seemed a little bit contingent, that I'm not sure if I am within it or outside it. And talking to other people and reading material about legal capacity, or simply the idea of, or ideas related to legal capacity, self-determination in one's own life, it's very clear that people have different ways of experiencing themselves and thinking of themselves in relation to this issue. And I think that we can look at in our own lives and in what we see of other people's lives how there are complex factors that shape the way we see ourselves, the extent to which we experience ourselves as exercising self-determination in our own lives, in the world, in public and private. So, do you see yourself as a master of your destiny, exercising free will? Tolstoy, in the epilogue to War and Peace, has a passage where he talks about himself in that way, and my reaction is, yeah, you're an upper class male in a society where you're the dominant ethnic group. Yeah, okay, you can be the master of your destiny, and it's very easy for you to see yourself that way, and without any doubt, completely confident of your position. Okay. Do you see yourself as a victim of circumstance, adapting to the will of others in order to survive? Do you see yourself as a being constituted by relationships and acting within, through, and on these relationships? That's sometimes the way I've seen myself. And it may sound weird, I don't know, but that's often the way that I have seen myself. Do you see yourself as a member of a community, depending on others and having duties towards others? That's the idea of interdependence that has become probably the most popular way that people talk about the CRPD understanding of legal capacity, although it's not usually made explicit that everyone actually has duties towards others. The notion of interdependence has become popularized. Um, and I think that it's flawed and it's not really adequately theorized. I think it has become in many ways more of a buzzword and a way of saying, well, everybody depends on others to some degree. So if we're acknowledging that some people, some at some times, or some people all the time, that if we're acknowledging, say, that all people need support some of the time, some people need support pretty much all the time, the degree of support that we need varies, that we can understand interdependence as a feature of human life, and if it's just a matter of degree, nobody has to be ostracized or made to feel bad about that. And it can't be a ground for excluding people from the right to make their own decisions. But I also feel that that way of thinking of legal capacity depends too much on the notion of support, and it's essentially a way to justify the inclusion in legal capacity of people who have varying support needs, people who have high support needs. And it's good as a justification for this more inclusive concept of legal capacity, but I don't think it's good enough as an understanding of legal capacity generally. because I think it makes support too central, and I think that the notion of how any of us uses support, what support means to us, is very is not is so support can be problematic, and I think support is particularly problematic, more so for survivors of psychiatry than for any other disability group, because often other people assume that we need support and we don't think that we do. So I think that it's important to not make everything about our understanding of legal capacity focus around support. I do think actually that legal capacity, from my perspective, I think legal capacity is about relations between people. And um, and if we understand legal capacity as relational, that's more general and that doesn't assume the centrality of support. So relations may be cooperative or competitive, and we may want to encourage a more cooperative approach rather than a competitive approach to decision making, as well as understanding that support needs are part of a cooperative rather than competitive approach. That's sort of how I would like to think about it. So how do factors like sex, class, race, ethnicity, age, disability, complex marginalization like forced psychiatry, homelessness, and prison shape the story that we tell about self-determination, as well as factors like culture, beliefs, and values? That's a question that we may see some different ways of thinking about the ways we relate ourselves to legal capacity being affected by these kinds of factors. I think that all of them can be highly significant. So how do these factors and our story relate to the dominant narrative about legal capacity, which I'm characterizing here as a contract between self-seeking rational actors, the way that I learned in law school about contract law and similar concepts, treating the exercise of agency within law as something engaged in by actors who are always pursuing their own interest to the exclusion of others, and on a basis of rationality rather than emotion or other kinds of values, simply rational self-interest. How do we relate our stories to that dominant narrative? Is that the way the dominant narrative exists in our countries, in our communities? If not, what is the dominant narrative, and how might there be different levels of dominant narrative? Have you made conscious decisions about relating yourself to the dominant narrative? So, for instance, if you grew up socialized female, you grew up being taught that, say, way back when I was growing up, being taught that the natural course of life is for you to become a wife and mother in addition to whatever career you may choose. And you weren't really taught to think about money and taking care of yourself financially. You weren't taught anything about negotiating. You weren't expected to engage in the world as a self-seeking rational actor, trying to get the most for yourself, can I then make decisions? Now I want to go out and stand up for myself. Now I don't think I'm being treated fairly in this contract situation, and I'm going to stand up for myself. I'm going to fight for my rights, notwithstanding that it still is what society would not expect me to do as a woman, that society would not want me to do as a woman. And is the dominant narrative as expressed in law relevant to your life? So are you a person who has negotiated contracts? If you sign many of the contracts that most of us sign in our daily lives, we have no negotiating power. We have no bargaining power. You sign a contract with the cell phone company, and you have no power to negotiate the terms of that contract. So, to what extent is legal capacity in that sense even effective in your life? And then if you are a person who has been put under guardianship, or if you're a person who's currently being forcibly psychiatrized under outpatient commitment, how does that, how I would imagine in that situation, you're knowing yourself as somebody who is being deprived of, who is simply being placed outside all of these rights and duties. And it doesn't mean that you stop making choices. It doesn't mean you stop making decisions. It means that certain decisions that you make are not given any legal effect. And in fact, there's other people who are empowered by law to make decisions that affect your life that you are powerless over. So in some cases, the dominant narrative as expressed in law might be a narrative that from which you have been deliberately by law excluded, and that is functioning to oppress you. I have this slide. Let me just see what how many other things I have here. Okay, I'm going to skip over this one, and I'll leave that for you for another to read. Policy questions. What can we learn from different narratives about legal capacity and self-determination? What is missing or seriously flawed in the dominant narrative beyond the exclusion of people with disabilities? And like I was starting to say before, from my point of view, grounded in understanding myself as female, a member of the subordinated sex class, in an understanding of women's liberation and feminism, is legal capacity itself relational rather than individual? What does this mean? It's not the same as interdependence. I see interdependence as the material relations. So I don't grow my own food. I am simply dependent on a vast network of what is in essence also called socialized labor, that I don't produce my own food. I depend on others. I live with my wife, and we live in a cooperative, obviously, relationship of each contributing to our common needs as a couple and as a household. I live in a community. I live in a society where the state paves the roads. So there's quite a lot of interdependence, and I see interdependence as material relations and contextual, depending on very specific circumstances everywhere. But what I mean about legal capacity being relational is something else. Legal capacity is a relation about relations. Now, I consider the law itself to always be about relations between human beings. So, for instance, property law about how do you decide who owns what property and what you can do on your property and how long you're going to own the property for, if do people own property together. It's called, in my system, it's called property law, but it's really the law about the relations between other human beings in relation to land. It's about, can I keep you from entering my home? Can I keep you from entering this land that the law says that I own? Can I can I have a toxic waste dump on my land? And if that waste affects you downstream, how do we relate to each other about it? So then I would say legal capacity is a relation about relations. It's a relation between the state and the individual, as I believe Amita Danda made that point in the advocacy note she wrote during the ad hoc committee for the World Network. It's a relation about relations between one individual and another, how we are constituted as legal subjects through our relationships with others, through our duties to them, through our claims and entitlements, that as the kinds of claims and entitlements that we have and our ability to assert them and our actions in asserting them. And I'm being very general and abstract here. I don't know if I'm probably not being clear enough, but this is a sort of emerging understanding that I'm trying to articulate, that I hope to be able to do a little bit more with some other time. What are the implications for reconstructing inclusive legal capacity? So my understanding of legal capacity and my advocacy about it has been more grounded in the general concept of equality and non-discrimination than in centering support per se. And often I've preferred to talk about equal legal capacity rather than, quote, the support model. Or when I talk about the support model or the supported decision-making model, I clarify that what I mean by that is equal legal capacity and we have support rather than substitution. If support and accommodations rather than substitution in situations where people may have needs to exercise their legal capacity where it's not being effective in the absence of essentially a more cooperative approach. So I've looked at things, the ways of the different levels of positive measures to ensure equal legal capacity, and the most general level is inclusive design of the whole system of legal capacity. And that I believe that the legal capacity reform proposal in Peru meets that specification. That's why it's the reform that is actually the most in line with CRPD, is that it's a redesign of legal capacity. It's going through the entire body of the civil code to make sure that it reflects the approach that everyone has the right to make decisions, that there have to be accommodations and supports, and that there's no substitution and no imposition of support without a, no imposition of support against a person's will. And the best interpretation principle makes it all seamless, so you don't have recourse to some measure that says now we deprive a person of their legal capacity. So that's how I see the reconstruction of inclusive legal capacity. And for me, it does relate to understanding legal capacity as relational, and support is one piece of it, but that's not the central focus. Policy implications, more on policy implications. So one thing that occurred to me, poverty and capitalism, one of the things that I first really thought about in as an intersectional issue with legal capacity is poverty. That what does it mean to promote legal capacity for people with disabilities as a right of self-determination when so many people with disabilities are living in very serious situations of poverty? Are we promoting the view that legal capacity, having a right to legal capacity and inclusive development, people will engage in entrepreneurship or go into the open labor market and be able to have a better life? To what extent are we upholding a system that many people aren't necessarily going to have a very good life, but will continue to be exploited? And we can also see collective levels of action as an expression of self-determination. So unionization and the organizing by workers for their rights on a collective level is also part of how we need to understand self-determination. Also, anti-colonial liberation struggles, I suppose. And I guess at this point, we're talking about, in general, fighting against neocolonialism and the legacies of colonialism where it has existed, women's liberation, and the re-envisioning of public and private. I guess that's a whole topic that I may not really have time to go into, but that I think that there's a need for looking at legal capacity in the enriched way that we come to it from the disability perspective. And now what I'm trying to introduce as an intersectional perspective on legal capacity, there's been a lot of feminist advocacy about ways in which the distinction that's made in our societies and in law between public and private has served men, so that that distinction enabled the law to allow men to physically and sexually assault their female spouses with impunity. So feminist advocacy has sometimes really ended up arguing for obliteration of that distinction between public and private. It was criticized to a certain extent by women of color, saying that they needed the understanding of privacy of their home as a way to as a refuge against the racism they experienced in the public world. For me, from a disability perspective, I also feel I'm not ready to give up the concept of private, because the having a private life, having a private subjective inner world, thoughts and conscience, and having privacy of my body and my brain is what is violated by psychiatry, and what psychiatry refuses to recognize, denies recognition to, and in the name of care violates my boundaries, violates my privacy as a separate organism and as a human being and a person with my own subjectivity, and a right to keep my thoughts private, and a right to keep private my behavior and my choices, and not have all of this put out in public view, um, for discussion by others that I haven't given consent to discuss aspects of my private life. I know that the criminal law will put a person's life as a matter of public discussion when that when a person has committed a crime or is accused of a crime. And then we're going to need to get to intersectionalities in relation to the criminal law in a little while. But other than the criminal law or breaches of duties to others, here we're talking about psychiatry as a system that puts my public affairs out in view of other people that I haven't consented to, without any kind of allegation that I've breached some general duty towards others. Rather, it's said to be for my own good, and that's something um, that makes me say, wait a minute, I need to really reassert this domain of the private as a matter of law, as well as social interactions. And there have been other feminist discussions of public and private that go into some of the nuances, and I think that there needs to be a different kind of envisioning of public and private in the law, one that is not centered on male experience, and one that essentially promotes and respects and protects the right of women to be in public situations, in all aspects and all levels of public life, whether public office, walking in the public street freely without harassment, and private in terms of having the right to our boundaries, having the right to deny contact to anyone, and that must be respected. So that's another a piece of it. And for me, I also start thinking about responsibility as a positive outward moving engagement. This is partly informed by my readings on restorative justice and approaches to justice and crime by indigenous peoples. We might look at responsibility as much as we can as a positive outward moving engagement that I have towards others and that others have towards me, rather than punishment and control, where the state takes on the primary role in controlling people's behavior, where it's not assumed that people are going to have a motivation to be ethical and behave well towards others out of a sense of actually having duties and responsibilities. Rather, it's assumed that we're only complying with the law because we don't want to be punished, and that can end up being a destructive thing. So restorative justice, in some sense, tries to shift that the other way. And I do see that as relating to legal capacity in the general sense of how do we see ourselves as legal subjects? How do we see ourselves as as people exercising rights and duties in relation to other people? And what's the relationship that the state and the law should have to that? I think it's a question how any of these things would come into the law per se. Then finally, bringing it back to legal capacity and legal equality as required by the CRPD, putting into practice and putting into law the CRPD approach and framework for legal equality of people with disabilities with all others will not solve all the problems. It's not going to solve all these intersectional problems. But by acknowledging intersectionality, I think that we can identify some of these areas and actually articulate them so that it doesn't have to interfere with or obscure the project of actually making sure that the law is just and fair and equal and inclusive to people with disabilities. And then I refer to the technical feasibility of law reform, philosophical underpinning, practical solutions for accommodation and support, and the need for political campaigns to promote the support and equality model. And this framework of technical, philosophical, practical, and political as a way to categorize the challenges of legal capacity reform is something that I set out in a very short paper, I think 1 or 2 pages, that I think I've made available. And I do think that, at least for me, in my thinking about it, I need to be able to identify these intersectional ways that the values, the underlying value of self-determination and autonomy that we're trying to implement by inclusive legal capacity needs to be contextualized, needs to be understood in relation to these various other systems, other kinds of oppression and liberation movements, in order to to understand the full scope of what we're fighting for, and finally to come and say, yes, we are fighting for all of this, and we need to put into practice the legal capacity for people with disabilities on a completely equal basis with others, because that is part of the justice that we are fighting for. Okay, going to us. Essentially, that was, we were doing Article 12, intersectionality. Now I'm talking about Articles 14 and 15. Arbitrary detention and torture. So thinking about questions, how might this relate to your life? In what ways has the state intervened violently in your life or the lives of people you know? In what ways has the state failed to protect you against other people's violence? How many ways besides forced psychiatry? And that those questions might be affected by factors like class, race, ethnicity, and sex. I think in some obvious ways that I would say the vast majority of women have been subjected to some form of sexual violence, and quite a number of men also. But it has been paradigmatically an experience that women have been taught to expect and have not been able to gain redress and protection in relation to. Other kinds of abuse that you may experience as a child, that women and some men may experience in a marriage or in other intimate relationship, and again that is paradigmatically leveled against women who are in some views promoted as the appropriate victims of such violence by men. The state intervening violently in your life, such as by law enforcement, police, criminal justice systems, other kinds of social service systems that have been violent in various ways, that how has that's often quite that's pretty much everywhere impacted by issues of class, and I would say also issues of race and ethnicity, where there's a dominant ethnic group in a country, that the state violent interventions are going to be leveled against those who are viewed as needing to be controlled, not for reasons of their own behavior so much as reasons of maintaining a particular hierarchy and structure of oppression. So we need to be able to look at that and think of the implications if we're isolating the experience of disability-based attention, i.e. psychiatric commitment, and the torture that goes along with that of forced psychiatry, forced psychiatric drugging, forced psychiatric, forced electroshock, restraint, etc. If we're isolating that and saying that this needs to be abolished, which it does, and which there's clear good reasoning based on anti-discrimination against people with disabilities, that it has to be abolished, still, how do we see that and its relationship to other systems? Oh, shoot. Hello? Can people hear me? I'm sorry, I lost the connection momentarily, and I will just try to go back where we were. I hope you can hear me again now. I'm going to just check and make sure it is still being recorded. Okay. So, I was talking about in what ways has the state intervened violently in your life or the lives of people you know? In what ways has the state failed to protect you against other people's violence? How many ways besides forced psychiatry? And that this can be affected by factors such as class, race, ethnicity, and sex. Typically, violence that is sexualized violence is not well enough protected against, and that is paradigmatically exercised by men against women, although it can there are certainly men also at times affected. It's something that women are taught to expect, um and oh no, it's going again. Hello? I, and I'm sorry, it looks like the connection has gone out, went out again. So I'm back. Maybe, I hope you can hear me again now. It seems like the connection went out again momentarily. I hope that it's going to keep working. And the point here is, how do we talk about abolition of disability-based detention, i.e. psychiatric commitment, and its relationship to other systems where the state is intervening coercively and or violently in people's lives. So at some point in the psych survivor movement in the United States, we had been talking about looking at the criminal justice system and saying, oh, they have better due process and they're criminals and we're not criminals. And that in many ways was insensitive to people who are being criminalized. In the US, it's very there's a great racial disparity, so that people of color are much more likely to be put into the police and prison system for acts that white people are doing in at least equal numbers, such as, for instance, use of drugs and selling of drugs. And so we know that there's that it's problematic to talk about to make comparisons where we're trying to where we're somehow shoring up the legitimacy, the political and social legitimacy of a criminal justice system that in fact is very racist and very unfair, and that many people with psychosocial disabilities are also caught up in. So looking at this from a more intersectional perspective, we see that we actually need to look at the two systems as both being systems of state repression, coercion, and violence, and and okay, and but then we can think, if we're going to understand that both systems are problematic, do we advocate for abolition of both systems of detention that in effect function as containment of poor people, as a form of social control that's based on maintenance of a hierarchy, of an oppressive hierarchy, and a hierarchy that facilitates exploitation? Do we have to treat both systems as being entirely the same, or can we differentiate at all? Or do we abolish disability-based detention first, or whether it comes first, we don't know in time, but do we advocate disability-based detention, in particular, the abolition of disability-based detention in its own right, because it's discriminatory and unjustifiable as a matter of law, that the law itself is saying that people can be targeted for this form of state control based on disability. It's discriminatory de jure and not only de facto, and that it's right and just to eliminate that, period. And then, or at the same time, promote decriminalization, sorry, promote decriminalization and restorative and transformative justice to deal with crimes of harm towards other individuals or the community. So decriminalization of crimes that that we might agree are actually shouldn't be crimes. So what's called I can't remember the word for it, but there's a kind of crime, disorderly conduct. It's a minor charge that can be brought against anybody for very vague reasons. And do we decriminalize, say, the selling of loose cigarettes on the street, which was the basis on which a man named Eric Garner was approached by police, and because he objected to them bothering him, they killed him. This was a man of color who was also a person with a disability in New York City. So that's what I mean by decriminalization, and then using restorative and transformative justice to deal with crimes of harm towards individuals or the community. And it's not necessarily clear in thinking about restorative and transformative justice that there is always a proposal to eliminate all forms of detention related to a judgment that a person has committed a crime, but the approach is designed to transform the entire system and address the harm done with the aim of restoring the person to relations with the community of a positive nature, and repairing any harm that has been done in a way that all members of the community can work together on such reparation, rather than making everything about focusing on this one individual and imposing punishment. So what does the reparations framework do to support and embrace transformation? Here I'm thinking, I'm looking at Article 15 and torture, forced psychiatric interventions as torture issues primarily, but it's also broader than that. for me, the idea of using the reparations framework came from the women's human rights movement mobilizing against systemic rape and sexual slavery as a weapon of war. I did some work in this area in my last year of law school, and it seemed to me that the reparations framework really had a lot of potential to be used to seek justice for both individuals and a collective group, and to transform the understanding of society. So, for instance, the women in the women in Asian countries who were put into the Japanese military system of sexual slavery, that they called them comfort women, um, during the Asia Pacific War. This was this was the context in which I was introduced to some advocacy on the question of reparations. And for instance, the significance of having of seeking a legal apology, of seeking an apology that acknowledged legal wrongdoing, and having compensation provided on an individual level, but not only compensation as monetary payment, rather compensation with an acknowledgement of actual wrongdoing and responsibility, was what the survivors sought as meaningful. And in addition, things like ensuring that history books told the true story of what happened. Thing there was I can't remember at this point all of the details of what they were seeking, but bringing in the reparations framework was a way to advocate for systemic measures, systemic remedies, both symbolic and material, for all of the victims. And that included changing society as a whole to in both to honor the victims and survivors, and also to ensure as much as possible that it wouldn't happen again, and that similar institutions that still exist in society, that, for instance, what's called trafficking, human trafficking, that is not only for sexual exploitation but other kinds of exploitation, and obviously the trafficking for sexual exploitation is a huge issue in itself, and that such trafficking and systems of prostitution go on in many areas of the world where the militaries are stationed. There's that we can look at. We can use a reparations framework also to look at where there are still vestiges or still elements of the same crime, the same abusive system, that still need to be addressed. One difference between that situation and what we're dealing with now in forced psychiatry is forced psychiatry has not yet been ended. So whereas that particular system of military sexual slavery was ended, and now it's the survivors looking for their just reparations. Those of us who have been harmed by forced psychiatry have a right to reparations, and we need for the whole system to stop. So we're kind of advocating that all in one piece. And then the first element is guarantees of non-repetition. That has to be, there has to be, before we start talking about any kind of meaningful apologies, even, there has to be an end to the practice. And because we're dealing with it on a systemic level, and not only those of us as individuals having a right to redress. I have also pointed out that psychiatric forced ingestion of mind-numbing drugs has structural similarities to rape without turning rape into a metaphor, which I think it's never acceptable to turn one human rights violation into a metaphor for another. It disrespects the actual violation. It's not acceptable to just use one thing as a metaphor, because it disrespects the situation of what rape is in itself. But I do believe that there are structural similarities and lessons that we can draw from the women's movement advocacy against rape and for the abolition and ending of rape, from the eradication of rape from our societies. So one issue is that consent versus non-consent, or mutuality versus unilateral imposition, is the distinction between violence and acceptable risk. And I tried very hard to frame it carefully here, because there's issues or debates, I would say, in feminism. What is the meaning of consent? And if we're talking about consent, are we still in a framework that assumes that men are sexual aggressors and women are sexually passive, and our consent is being solicited, and consent is a kind of formal thing, and that if you say, or to be interpreted, or it ends up being something that the concept of consent can actually be used against a person. Did she consent? Did she not consent? Whereas in reality, I think it may be better to talk about mutuality versus unilateral imposition. I think that for me, that sounds clearer as to what we're talking about, because consent and non-consent is actually a kind of paradigm like contract theory, an offer and an acceptance. I offer a certain business deal and you might accept it or refuse it. Whereas in sexual conduct, we really need to take a more cooperative approach, not the competitive self-seeking approach that is derived from contract theory. And I believe similarly, in situations of mental health services, the paradigm of self-seeking contract theory is not really appropriate. We need a paradigm of respect for autonomy that isn't based on competition, but rather is based on cooperation and respect for autonomy. Cooperation does not mean that we blur our boundaries and, in the name of care, anything goes. So I was using the framing here, mutuality versus unilateral opposition, and mutuality is a concept that Sherry Mead and Chris Hansen have developed in intentional peer support. I'm pretty sure I've given you a reference to that if you want to see how they talk about it. And it's a distinction between violence and acceptable risk. So in sexual interactions, becoming vulnerable in intimacy, there is a risk. There are risks of all kinds. It's not necessarily that the distinction we want to draw is between violence and pleasure or violence and enjoyment. Really, what we're drawing is a distinction between violence and acceptable risk. And the same way, if somebody chooses to take a psychiatric drug or to engage in psychotherapy or some other kind of mental health service, we don't know if it's going to be a good experience, but the distinction, if we choose it, we're hoping for a good experience. And so it's a choice between violence, it's a distinction between violence and acceptable risk. That I think, for me, thinking about these two kinds of paradigmatic situations, the situation, the issue of rape and sexual assault versus mutual intimacy that I encounter as a woman, that I encounter as a feminist, and the situation of forced psychiatry that we're framing as torture that I encounter as a survivor and a disability activist, helps to clarify the kind of standard that I actually want to use in both situations. Another issue here is that the harm and bringing out that I can see as relevant to both rape, sexual assault, and forced psychiatry. The harm and injury is both mental and physical from unwanted intimate intrusion. And the harms include things like dissociation, isolation from community, and serious post-traumatic reactions. And in both these situations, at least from some points of view, from the dominant point of view that sees that is based on male perspective, that is based on perspective of people who consider themselves to be mentally healthy, or however they might characterize it, and haven't been subjected to forced psychiatry. The harm done by these kinds of acts may not even be visible as harm. And so we've been put in a position of actually asserting, articulating, and describing how the harm is harm. That in situations, in situations of torture that have not that are paradigmatically what males do to other males, we're not in that kind of position of having to actually argue and fight for the right to be included in this framework. Hostility towards the victim, blaming, minimizing, protecting abusers who have a high social position. And that the state delegates or authorizes others to carry out violence on its behalf. So in forced psychiatry, the state actually directly, through their mental health laws or capacity laws, in most countries actually directly delegates and authorizes psychiatrists, and other personnel in the mental health system to carry out acts of violence against our bodies. And in the situation of rape and sexual assault, it used to be in many countries, it may still be in some places, that once a woman marries a man, that she has no right to refuse sex. So in essence, that he can rape her with total impunity. And it also used to be that he could assault her with his fists with impunity. And then there's the level of to what extent the state's measures of criminalization and protection against these kinds of assaults, sexual and physical, by men against women, especially, and whether they've been in intimate situations or whether they're strangers, are actually effectively used to stop and prevent these violations from happening, to what extent the state takes seriously these violations, and to what extent negligent actions or failures by the state actually amount to condoning acts of male violence against women. So, like the well, actually, systemic rape and sexual slavery as a weapon of war was considered a widespread and systematic grave violation. When we were looking at that, we certainly would also couldn't avoid realizing that rape itself is a systemic, widespread, and grave violation. That is not the problem was that it's not necessarily practiced in an organized way. It's practiced by isolated individuals. So it's maybe a structural, systematic violation. Forced psychiatry is practiced in an organized way, systematically. It's widespread in a large number of countries, less so in some others. What are we going to do about it? Can we take this advocacy based on the logical categorization of forced psychiatry as torture, as a wide, systematic, grave violation, as a widespread and systematic form of torture practiced against people with disabilities? And I say logical because we're taking a logical category, we're taking a category that has been expressed and articulated as a general matter, and we notice that this experience, this violation, fits within the category, and yet it has not been adequately recognized by human rights authorities as being this type of violation, partly because it is so widespread. It's so very widespread everywhere in the world, including and especially by the countries that are politically dominant in the world, and even in the human rights sphere, such as Norway, a country that prides itself on being a leader in human rights, and yet it has quite a bit of forced psychiatry. So, the way I would like to understand, oh, it's connection lost again. Hello? I think I'm back. Apologies for the connection going out. I don't know what the problem has been. So, tells me the connection is restored now. And I'll just finish up here saying that the way I understand the reparations framework, it's actually very much linked to restorative justice and transformative justice. It's a similar way of looking at violations systemically and looking at what can be done to repair and prevent. How can the whole community become involved? And it involves accountability of people who have harmed others, but it also goes way beyond that to transform the situation that led to the harm and transform the community in a way that aims to prevent further harm from occurring. And the concept of transformative equality also, that not sure how much I've talked about it, but I wrote about it in one of my papers, that is a concept pioneered by the CDOC committee that really applies to the disability area as well. CDOC committee being Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which monitors the treaty by the same name in the United Nations. It's a concept that has to do with obligations of the state in implementing non-discrimination obligations to look at the whole, to look at the nature of power relations, to look at the to look at the situation holistically and comprehensively as to what are the root causes of the inequality that we're perceiving, and what needs to be transformed in society, and how I think it's a big question how the state can intervene. Who is it who is supposed to intervene if the state itself is also a reflection and if the state is also reflecting and manifesting and reinforcing some of these inequalities? If the state is part of the problem, where does the transformation have to start? But I think it's something that's been, like I said, pioneered by the CDOC committee, and that is certainly relevant in the disability field as well, when we're talking about upending many of these concepts and legal doctrines that um, that we see are directly causing harm to people with disabilities. That the CRPD itself, the negotiation, the drafting, and its putting into practice, is an example of transformative equality in practice at the international human rights level. So, conclusions: intersectionality is an analytical tool, a methodology, or even a consideration that allows us to complete the analysis of some issue that we're working on, to link it to other issues to which it is materially and structurally related, and avoid displacing the effects of one oppression onto another. It leads to a deeper, richer analysis and appreciation of tools that we have from each framework, and the potential for change and limitations of change in any one area, I see it as okay. And in addition, we need to look at contextualization of all kinds. That's not always about intersecting oppression. Like I said, sometimes cultural values and beliefs, um, and other aspects of a person's identity might be important to might be important even if they are not about oppression, but either way they help to guide suitable solutions. So both tailoring to various aspects that contextualize a person's experience of a particular issue, and also dismantling power inequalities when it is about intersecting oppressions. So I see that I've talked for nearly the whole time. I'd like to give you a chance. If you have questions or comments, you can type it in the chat, or you can ask for the microphone. And remember that we're being recorded if you want to ask for the microphone. And I see you've shared a link on sexual harassment, violence, and abuse global levels. That we can look at that if you want, but I appreciate it. Let's see if there's other comments or questions. I'll go to that link and see what we have there. Okay, so sexual harassment around the globe and various statistics, percentages who've experienced sexual harassment. I think I'm interested to know whether if whether the information or ideas I presented were clear enough, whether they were interesting or useful to you, if there's any comments or otherwise. Oh, and I'll also just point out, I do have this slide with links to other articles by Kimberly Crenshaw that I would highly recommend. In the user survivor movement, Bhargavi Davar in India has done some very good work on anti-colonialism in particular, also a gender perspective. And I've linked to a couple of her articles. In the US, there's a group that started it's gotten organized through Facebook and regular phone calls, called Surviving Race: The Intersection of Injustice, Disability, and Human Rights, that has been working in a very good way on the intersection of race and disability oppression for survivors of psychiatry, users and survivors of psychiatry, and also in principle addressing other kinds of oppression as well, such as sexism. And then I've also linked to a WNUSP side event, Violence Against Women and Girls with Disabilities, Intersectional and Double Violence in Medical and Institutional Settings. Okay, I see you're getting ready to write one question. I'll also take this opportunity to thank you who joined me for this lecture, and everyone in the course for participating, and to say that I will welcome receiving any papers that you still are going to send in, and that I will be sending out a survey. I will be creating and sending out a survey um, to get your feedback, and that I'm open to ways that we can stay in touch, even though the sort of formal plan part of the course has ended. And I want to, if you want to ask a question, do you want me to give you the microphone, or would you rather? Okay, here it is in the chat. Could restorative justice, as pertaining to forced psychiatry, include user survivor panels in academia to help teach psychiatrists and other psychosocial professionals? I think certainly it could. Um, Restorative justice and or the reparations framework, I think I would want to be careful about the nature of such panels and how they're viewed and how they're meant to be used, because I think it's important to start out from a perspective that forced psychiatry is wrong and is a human rights violation. I know that people have been doing those kind of panels and working in this way for a very long time. In some places, these kind of panels exist, and yet they're treated as a kind of stakeholder. They're treated as a kind of like patient perspective, a way of enhancing the opportunity for these professionals in training to see how the people they're treating are experiencing their treatment, and to be able to provide better treatment. And they haven't taken adequate account of um, the fact that what they're doing is actually abusing our bodies. They're actually committing acts of violence for which they need to be held accountable, which currently the state is condoning and acquiescing in. But I think that it's kind of problematic if the user survivor movement is addressing psychiatrists without making without essentially confronting them as perpetrators, and without some perpetrators, whether I'm not saying there may be individual psychiatrists who haven't perpetrated this violence, um, but so long as the profession has this authority by law and continues to fight to keep this authority by law, the profession as a whole is a perpetrating profession. It's a violent profession. And so I would like to see, as part of abolition of forced psychiatry, I mean, let's say we abolish forced psychiatry, and it's understood, or even at the point when the psychiatric profession or the Department of Psychiatry in a particular academic institution decides, yes, we are going to teach everyone that that they have to completely respect the person's autonomy and never commit them against their will, never hold them against their will, um, never give them drugs against their will, never try to pressure them into accepting drugs they don't want. Let's say we have a department of psychiatry that takes that position and they want to bring in a user, then I think it's very appropriate. Absolutely, you have a user survivor panel to help educate them. And, even, I think there can be a use for users and survivors to be educating even before that happens, but I think it has to be on the table. It always has to be on the table that we are not under an obligation to soft pedal to psychiatrists that they're perpetrating human rights violations. And too often they not only expect us to soft pedal, they demand it from us. And that I think is really unacceptable, and I think leads to situations where people end up compromising themselves and compromising the advocacy in order to simply be heard. So I think that especially now that we have the CRPD, we have this as a standard in international law, whether or not our country has ratified, it exists in international law. And, for the US, I don't know if I've talked about the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention having made a report, I think I did, that applies the same standards to the US. So it's happening as a standard everywhere in the world. And that's being applied to every country in the world, one way or another. And that we have to, if we don't use and advocate this standard, we are going to lose it, because then it would be showing that we don't even take it seriously ourselves. So that's why I've promoted, since the convention was adopted, it's crucially important for survivors ourselves to take it up and insist on the standard everywhere. So, yeah, and you're saying reparations would be a better frame to teach up and coming professionals. And yes, it's good to teach up and coming professionals. And, I think to the extent that you can come in and educate them honestly, I think it can be worth doing, because you never know when you're going to reach people. I just think that it has to be very upfront about, I think there really always has to be the point made that the force and coercion is a human rights violation, and that what we're talking about has to start from the premise that good practice means we're not doing that. That if you think you want to do that, it's a problem, and you have to. The solution is not to do it and then try and figure out what went wrong. The solution is to not do it and immediately just find other ways to deal with your impulse. The same as, in any situation, we're not going to say, gee, if I really want to hit that person, I'm going to hit them and then I'm going to figure out later what went wrong. No, the answer is you have to learn how to deal with your impulse to hit the person in some other way. So I really think it's important to bring out that kind of framing. And I have not very often been in a position of talking to mental health professionals, because they have not been particularly willing to hear that. Now things may be changing. The World Health Organization has come out with materials and statements supporting the abolition of forced treatment. So they have been willing to hear the even more critical perspective that I've brought, because they in part have, have in some of the ways that they are putting details to this, it's not really quite adequate. And so yes, that's one possibility as a way to go. And for people who have a good sense of how to reach mental health professionals, I think it's certainly worthwhile to educate them about abolition and what they should do, how they should deal with these violent impulses they have. I would like to see that. Anyway, I'm going to close. Thank you for staying with me, and I very much appreciated your papers, and look forward to receiving everything that people still want to send in, and to have think about ways that you might want to continue discussions even though the class has ended. So thanks very much. I'm going to close now. Goodbye for now.